Coogs House. The Houston Cougars have a tall task this weekend in front of them, but we have to dive a little deeper into what's going on this weekend with Kansas State. We brought someone on to help us out.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, daily podcast up by your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater that came to stop by, and I got the impression there's a few of you out there. Welcome and thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Appreciate you making us your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Cougs. If you want to join the conversation but don't know what to say, tell us what your favorite cut of barbecue meat is, because I'm about to bring on someone from the state of Kansas State, Ryan Gilbert of Power Cats, the 24/7 channel with Kansas State Wildcats. And I got to ask Ryan if it's like a one meat barbecue plate, because I think the answers in Texas and Kansas are a little bit different on this. What's your barbecue meat of choice before we get too far into this?
First of all, Parker, thanks for having me on. Obviously I'm from Kansas City, born and raised, and came to Kansas State for school and just kind of stuck around here. But, I've had my fair share of barbecue without a doubt. I would have to go with a nice brisket sandwich. If anybody, the listeners are going to be in Kansas City anytime soon for any reason, I can give them all the recommendations on the restaurants, but man, nothing beats a nice brisket sandwich.
All right, so brisket's something I think we can all agree on, right? That's fair. Yeah. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, and we got tons of fun to talk about that later. But Ryan joins us as an insider following the Kansas State Wildcats as close as anyone out there. And I guess I want to hear from the horse's mouth itself, I guess the Wildcats' mouth itself. Bluntly, I picked Kansas State at the start of the season to win the conference in our Big 12 show. I came off of last season thinking they were really impressive, and the 4-star quarterback kind of going to come into his own this year, et cetera, in Avery Johnson. Walk us through the season, because you are presently 7-1, and frankly, it kind of feels like every game is a de facto playoff game for Kansas State at this point. How did Kansas State get here?
Well, I don't want to say that the BYU game was a fluke. I don't want to say it was an outlier, but that's because Kansas State has struggled against Tulane on the road. Kansas State escaped in an ugly win against KU last Saturday, and so they've had some ugly performances. But with what happened in Provo, that was really just an uncharacteristic performance from this team. You look at the final score and all that, I get it. It was ugly. It wasn't pretty. But K-State just had a couple of turnovers and mishaps kind of snowball against them. And, you blinked and it was like a 20-point deficit after K-State was ahead for most of the first half with field goals. But so, you throw out that BYU game and K-State would be undefeated right now. But at the end of the day, K-State was kind of in the early stages of the season and allowed some of that adversity to kind of get to them out in Provo. So that loss stings on the resume. When you look at the Big 12 title, you need BYU to lose a lot, like 3 games, unless you're perfect. And same thing goes for that Iowa State game. The Cyclones are playing well. They haven't lost either. And so K-State needs to win out. If not, you need a lot of help. And so I don't think you're getting that. So it's unfortunate with what happened in Provo, but it did. And K-State responded well. Don't get me wrong. They've been pretty good by and large, but that one still stings for sure.
Well, and you mentioned, and I hadn't really put it together till you just said it, but it very quickly clicked, that it's been road games. It's at Tulane. There was a close one at Colorado. Kansas isn't a road game, but for all intents and purposes, I mean, you're both it's an interstate rivalry, right? Like it's all they're all between one another. Is there anything about this team playing outside of Manhattan, or potentially have a bunch of fans? I mean, KU I'm sure has fans all over the state, right? Or are those games close for some other reason? Is Colorado a close game for some other reason?
Well, Chris Kleiman over the last couple of years has not been well on the road, and so it's been nice to see this Kansas State team against West Virginia as well as Colorado pick up victories away from home. And I know Colorado was a narrow win. They had to kind of squeak out there, but a win's a win, right? And that West Virginia win was very impressive. I think with Avery Johnson being a true sophomore quarterback, and I don't want to put everything on him, good or bad, but largely a team's success is dependent on the quarterback play. And so, Johnson, struggled early on in the year. I think he was I think the coaching staff was trying to ease him into the playbook a little bit. They were trying to get his feet wet before diving all the way in with everything. But he's a 4-star guy, and he's a great player. I think he just had to mature a little bit early on in this year, and it shows that he's kind of learned from those ugly road games early on with back-to-back road wins now. And so, Johnson hasn't been perfect, but he's been lethal with his legs. He's shown his upside with his arm. He's been a little bit inconsistent at times throwing, but by and large, when a team is 7-1, like I said, that largely falls on a quarterback's play.
Well, and I'm sure he'll pop up later when we talk about difference makers for this particular weekend. But in looking at the last 8 games, we're 2/3 through the year, and I guess he spot played some as a true freshman. But these are his first 8 games as a starter, and it's a whole lot different deal, right? What growth, you mentioned his arm, is kind of up and down. What growth have you seen out of the kid over 8 games? Because he is still so young.
Well, I hate to keep harping on it, but against BYU, it was mistake after turnover, and Avery Johnson has had mistakes and turnovers since then, but he has done a tremendous job of hitting the reset button, not hitting the panic button, and just staying calm and poised. And the whole offense has as well. But Johnson early on in the year, he was kind of letting mistakes compound and snowball, whereas over the last handful of games, he's done a great job just throwing those bad plays in the trash and never looking at them, right? So, he's been, obviously it helps out a lot when you have such a solid rushing attack, and I'm sure we'll get into that with DJ Giddens, the explosiveness of Dylan Edwards, and what Avery Johnson, ignoring his passing, right? He can do a lot with his feet, so that helps his passing game, whether he's good or bad with his arm, right? It helps to have a nice, solid rushing attack for the entirety of the offense, without a doubt. But yeah, Johnson, he's been getting better game by game. It's kind of like the stock market, right? It's just kind of going up as it goes, right?
So outside of, honestly, BYU, I would argue the defense has been pretty strong up there at Kansas State, holding Oklahoma State to 20, West Virginia to 18. The West Virginia game being in West Virginia as well. What do we need to know about that defense? I mean, it was a shutout for Houston a year ago. It was the first shutout in like 20-something years at that point for Houston. What do we need to know about that side of the ball? Because clearly something's working over there.
Yeah, it's been a good group. Joe Klanderman's bunch has been solid. The one kind of weakness on that side of the ball for Kansas State really has been the tendency to give up the big play. There's been probably a dozen times this year where K-State has given up a home run ball simply because of a missed coverage or a blown assignment. Guys have been wide open in that secondary. And so that's kind of been the Achilles heel, for this team. And other than that,
I get that as an Achilles heel, but like y'all could do that a few times this weekend, and I wouldn't complain about it. If you want to leave someone open back there, right? I'm cool with that. I'm cool with that.
Yeah, I'm sure opposing teams have loved it. Yeah, without a doubt. But if you take that away, they're tremendous to the Big 12's best defense in terms of stopping the run and yardage per game. And I know quarterback sacks skew that a little bit, but don't get it twisted. They're very solid stopping the run. But when they're not giving up those big explosive plays, and I know this maybe sounds kind of silly, but when they're not giving up those explosive plays, it's a very tough defense to pass on. Other than that, when they're in man-to-man, they're tremendous. It's when they're in zone is when they kind of have some things fall through the cracks. And it's not just like, opposing players are finding the weak spot. They're finding a wide open spot where K-State's just completely blowing an assignment, like I said. And so, I know that Houston is not a team that, you correct me if I'm wrong, but not a team that's going to do much throwing the ball. I know Chris has been, he had more rushing attempts than passing attempts against Utah. And so maybe that's maybe something that K-State would favor K-State rather, in this game is that Houston maybe doesn't have that lethal threat through the air. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but just based off of what I'm looking at.
No, I think that's fair. I think on the books, they officially had 13 passes attempted last weekend, which is not a whole heck of a lot. I want to talk about this weekend's matchup and kind of what you're talking about as well in a second. Before we get too far, I do want to talk about this weekend's game being presented by our buddies at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 back in bonus bets if you win. FanDuel Sportsbook app, everything you need to watch NFL games or whatever games you're looking at, all in one place. Check out stats, play-by-play, and more at the same spot you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. Get started with $150 in bonus bets again if you put your first $5 bet down and win. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Parker Ainsworth here with the Locked On Cougs, talking again to Ryan Gilbert of Go Power Cat, the Kansas State Wildcats arm of 24/7. And this weekend, you mentioned in the first segment that Zion Chris, we call him a dual threat quarterback, but the truth is with Houston, they've really only used one of those with any real extent. Now, both of their touchdowns last weekend came on passes, so I should, it's not like he can't throw the ball, but Houston on the books attempted just 13 passes. 2 were called back for penalties, so I guess 15, right, or whatever, right? But Kansas State's not a team that's when they've lost, it's because teams have run on them, but they've been pretty successful stopping the run, right? So does a dual threat quarterback present issues? Jalen Daniels in Kansas gave you a pretty good scare last weekend, right?
Yeah, I think that's maybe one thing that favors Kansas State is the fact that this team has faced a couple of dual threat quarterbacks as of late. You mentioned Daniels. The week before that was West Virginia. Garrett Green was a guy that could run it. And then their backup who went in, it didn't seem like the game plan really changed. And so in terms of running the ball with the quarterback. So, K-State's kind of got some practice preparing for this. And you look at in practice, right? Avery Johnson can certainly run it. And so they've gone up against that every week just in practice. And so, obviously it's something that could present some challenges for the defense, but without a doubt, it's something that this defense has seen a little bit as of late.
So talk to me then, because the Big 12 is a weird league. It feel like an upset every weekend, whether it's Baylor putting up a 60-piece on Texas Tech or who knows, right? And frankly, y'all were the victim of that, I would argue, in a week earlier this season. What Kansas State's not sleeping on this one, right? So what are they getting ready? Like, what would make a Kansas State fan nervous about good old 3-5 Houston? I mean, is it just the fact that it's a trappish feeling game, and what's going on there?
Well, Houston's won 2 of the last 3, and so Kansas State's probably not going to take this one lightly. But that Sunflower Showdown, the rivalry with Kansas, means a lot to a lot of guys on this team. If you're from Kansas, it obviously means a ton. But even if you're not, your teammate next to you, top to bottom, that was an emotional victory for Kansas State. So that's something that I think can kind of go in Houston's favor, is that you might get some sort of hangover from such an emotional game, a night game, which is weird. We're going to have an afternoon kickoff in Houston. Knock on wood that weather doesn't delay that, but I forgot what those are like. Anyway.
Yeah, little different when you're playing on ESPN Plus like Houston is most weekends.
Yeah, it's gonna be different for sure. But yeah, Houston, Houston's got probably a good mentality heading into this game. Like I said, they've won some games lately. And Kansas State, with a bye week coming up after this Houston game, you can't get caught looking ahead. I think if you're the coaching staff, you say, yes, give us 60 minutes of hard playing football, and then you can enjoy a bye week. But at the same time, you don't want to just get your guys looking ahead towards next week. They went to Boulder, right? And then they went to like West Virginia, 2 opposite ends of the country, different time zones, and then they come back for a rivalry game against KU. And so I don't want to say that they're like insanely beaten up, worn down, but like that travel and the rivalry game, like that does take a lot out of you physically and mentally.
Well, and you mentioned it's a different environment. It's not the mountains of Boulder, Colorado. It's not the whatever we want to call West Virginia. But Houston is, it's still hot here in Texas. Not as hot as it is in the summertime, but high 83 I'm seeing on my weather app right now on Saturday. Might have some rain, which for the folks that maybe are listening to this from the Kansas State side of things, so we apparently had a bunch of those yesterday. It's really humid in the city of Houston. how do those does the weather play a role here at all? I mean, maybe a little bit, kind of, sort of, right? I mean, it can't not be at anything.
Yeah, it's actually pretty comparable, to Tulane. Earlier on in the year, it was supposed to rain that game, and it rained basically all up until kickoff, and then it was pretty clean, and then it after the game it started pouring again. But obviously hot, humid, that stuff kind of. I think K-State's prepared for something like this because of Tulane. It's almost identical.
Yeah,
I would be much more concerned as a K-State fan with just this team's struggles on the road. The last two outings, West Virginia, Colorado, have been great. They've been wins, and that's all that matters at the end of the day. But I think you're crazy if you're a K-State fan and the struggles at Tulane and the BYU loss don't at least linger just a little bit in the back of your mind.
So I know you cover Kansas State on a daily basis, 24/7, and obviously this is a Houston Cougars show. Y'all cover them. Y'all have your own podcast, Go Powercat, and y'all do all kinds of good content on them. Let's say your next show, you're all very disappointed. Let's say things go Houston's way. What path to that do you see as like a hole in the armor of sorts of your Kansas State Wildcats? Because again, I think we both think they're pretty talented. But what path to victory would a Houston fan, or what would you be worried about, I guess, as a Kansas State fan? Is it just the weather, just the road thing, et cetera? Or is there any schematic kind of thing you'd be worried about?
I would just say the rushing attack on both sides. If Houston was to pull off this upset, it would be that Willie Fritz's guys were able to establish that rushing attack like we know they're capable of, with a mobile quarterback who can use his legs. And, that's certainly something that could happen against Kansas State's defense. I mentioned the good stats and all, but it's not like a Georgia or Bama type defense. They're not perfect. So I could see a world in Houston setting up that rushing attack. And then on the other side of the ball, right, Kansas State, if they're not able to, establish that, maybe Avery Johnson's playing on the road and he's kind of got a lot of pressure on him and he makes a bad decision. He's pressured. I'm not saying that will happen, but that's probably the most likely thing. If Houston were able to come out of here with a win, I think it would be the rushing attack on both sides was won by Houston. And so,
well, you mentioned Willie Fritz's idea of this too, and it's been a couple years. I think it was 2022. Tulane did upset Kansas State, I think, in a non-conference game with Willie Fritz there. Now, that Tulane team was really good. Houston fans lost to them. We lost them as well, right? We remember them very closely. A very different-looking Tulane team than this Houston team, although a couple of the same characters actually transferred over, but not very many. Not a lot. I guess I want to feel like there was a Fritz advantage there. Was that more about Kansas State not being ready to play a good smaller conference opponent early in the year? Do you remember that one at all?
Yeah. I mean, Kansas State won the Big 12 that year. And so that was a good, objectively speaking, football team, right? Now, was it K-State just overlooking a non-power school? Who knows what really went into that. But bottom line was that Tulane was ready to play that game and won that game. Chris Kleiman mentioned on Monday his respect for Willie Fritz. They kind of have similar upbringings, so to speak, stuff like that. So, Chris Kleiman, he never bad talks a coach, but you can tell when there's a lot of respect for a coach because he'll go out of his way in his pressers to kind of compliment them and what they do well. And so certainly did that with Willie Fritz. So yeah, I guess that's also another thing that does that favor in K-State's way or not? I don't know, but Chris Kleiman is without a doubt there's not a whole bunch of guys in that locker room that were there a couple years ago, but there's still some guys. And so maybe that's something that's on the mind is that, yeah, this coach did upset us a few years ago. Sorry.
No, it's funny. You mentioned that's the year Kansas State won the conference. I almost, because of TCU making the playoff that year, I think people do forget that Kansas State won this whole conference less than 24 months ago. Like that wasn't that long ago. Obviously, different quarterback situation and other parts of the roster changes. College football, that happens very quickly. But Kansas State's going for their second Big 12 title in 3 years, and I think that is maybe a little bit under the radar because of the year TCU had that year. I want to talk about difference makers in this game and kind of get down to some brass tacks about guys. Maybe even talk a little bit about the spread here. It's 12.5 points. it's an interesting number for sure. Before we get too far, I do want to remind you that if you need a little bit extra energy, it's a hot and humid day game, and sometimes that can wear you down a little bit, or you just need a little bit more, I don't know, pepping your step this weekend. 5-Hour Energy is the group you got to get with. They're a great partner to have because, frankly, I said I'm a teacher, I'm a coach, I have a podcast, do a bunch of different things, bunch of different jobs, and I always need a 5-Hour Energy every day after lunch. Just pop one of those down, keep the day going, keep all through the evening. It lasts me, frankly, if I'm being honest, a lot longer than 5 hours. Now, you got a big game this weekend. You're going to tailgate, have fun all morning, blackout game in the afternoon, and hopefully celebrating a win in the evening. That's going to take some energy. That's going to take a 5-Hour Energy. 5-Hour Energy knows that no matter what team you root for, being a fan requires heart, soul, and a whole lot of energy, whether you're prepping for the big tailgate or ironing your jersey. Your game day to-do list is always a mile long, and that's why the limited edition Stand the Fan 5 Energy Shot is here to keep you fueled throughout the season. What's your fan fuel this week? Whatever it is, do it with a 5-Hour Energy, available at 5hourenergy.com, available to be shipped nationwide. Parker Ainsworth here at Locked On Coogs, joined again by Ryan Gilbert of GoPowerCat.com over with 24/7 Sports, talking about Kansas State and Houston this weekend. And I think it's too big a cop-out for me, but I think a big piece of how this weekend's game is going to go is how young quarterback Avery Johnson steps up to the plate in a road game. Am I crazy for thinking it's that simple? I mean, you mentioned putting a lot on the quarterback's back earlier in the show, but I really think it's as simple as, like, if he's the true dual threat quarterback, it's gonna be really tough sledding for Houston.
Yeah, and I don't know if Avery Johnson's 1,000% healthy right now, and I know that nobody is at 8 games through a season, but he's been a little timid with his rushing as of late against KU. We noticed a few things on our end that maybe he's not fully 1,000% there. He didn't have a single rushing attempt at all against West Virginia the week prior, and so if he can get going, absolutely, I think that's the best formula for a K-State victory, aided by the rushing with DJ Giddens and Edwards and a couple open receivers here and there. But I wouldn't necessarily count on that, just because Johnson hasn't been as lethal as he probably can be with his legs as of late. So, obviously I said this earlier, quarterback plays well, they're probably going to win. But it's been, with what the rushing attack has done, I don't know if you necessarily need Avery Johnson to go out and be a Heisman candidate type performance.
So the other leg of that rushing attack is, I didn't mean to do that, but DJ Giddens is a very talented running back. What, as someone who watches him much closer than myself, for a Houston Cougar fan, what does he do well? And frankly, if you could give us some tidbits on what he doesn't and how to exploit, like, that'd be nice too.
Well, honestly, I don't know if there's anything that DJ Giddens doesn't do well. He's a very, very complete back. I've got people that are saying he is going to be in the NFL one day. He can block, he can catch passes, he's versatile, he can get downhill in a hurry, he's got speed, he's got great vision, patience, and so he really can do everything. I would think of a guy like Le'Veon Bell, Joe Mixon, guys that can just do it all. So Giddens has been great. He had that fumble against BYU, which opened the floodgates for things to go south. But other than that, I mean, he's been great. That being said, he had, I think 50 some yards against West Virginia. And then obviously against Kansas, he did get over 100, but he had a rush go for 54. And so you take that off and he's around 50 yards for the night. So the last couple of weeks, Giddens has kind of been held in check. But I think largely that's because teams are just trying to sell out, load the box and stop the run. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Houston does that. I wouldn't say it's worked. It's worked stopping Giddens, without a doubt, 100%. But obviously, Avery Johnson's made teams pay through the air, and so.
Well, and that's when. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's when, like, a wide receiver like Jace Brown becomes a bigger factor, and those kind of things.
That was against Colorado. K-State's down. I think it was 28-24 with a couple minutes left, and they were getting a one high look on that final drive, and they tried a deep ball to Jace Brown, didn't get it. Next play was a pass to DJ Giddens, whatever. Third play of that drive, the ultimate game winner, they got the same single one high look again, and Brown was, I don't want to say he's wide open, but he had separation, beat his man, and scored a touchdown. So they can get those guys for sure.
And you're worrying me because one of the things I was thinking Houston was going to do this week is probably play a lot of one high to pull a guy I think they need to have down in the box this week is AJ Halsey. He's a strong safety, a big hitter, has a handful of picks. He can cover. I don't mean that, but I'd imagine he kind of would either be spying Johnson or in the box, adding in extra hat in there, that kind of stuff. That does put Kentrell Webb as a single high behind him, and that leaves open these potential seam routes and that kind of stuff. And so that obviously, knowing that is what Colorado happened in Colorado is worrisome. Tell me, I'm worried about Austin Romaine as a Houston Cougar fan. Talk to me about that guy, and please make me feel less worried about him. Can you do that for
me? Well, first of all, Halsey, you mentioned that he had the game winner, or not the game winner, but the pick against Utah, right? To set him up.
Yeah, he had the pick, and 10 yards later to set up a field goal. Yeah. So turned the ball over for us.
So I think that's maybe the way that Houston might want to go. Be aggressive, right? If Avery Johnson beats you with a deep ball, so be it. But force him, try to take your chances and pick off a pass, put pressure on him. We'll see if Houston does that or not. Take your chances. But with Austin Romaine, he's been, I would say, probably the biggest surprise on defense. Maybe if not the entire team. He obviously had the strip on Jalen Daniels against KU on Saturday, which set up a game-winning field goal, pretty identical to what Houston had against Utah, but also a scoop and score against Tulane. Parker, I don't think K-State gets out of New Orleans with a win if Austin Romaine didn't have a strip that led to a scoop and score against Tulane. I genuinely don't know if they win that game. So he's been an X factor, and obviously he's explosive. He can make those home run plays on defense, but even when he's not, he's just very solid all around as well.
So, I always start at Pro Football Focus to kind of get an idea of what guys to look at, and then I go watch games after that. I thought it was weird for a team that I think of as being pretty strong in the trenches to not really have a whole lot of highly rated guys relative to the rest of their defense. It's a lot of corner safeties and linebackers as far as the top guys rated on Pro Football Focus. And it doesn't look like a snap count thing, like they're rotating a ton of guys through or something like that. What can you tell me about those front guys? And frankly, I'm going to ask you next, like what can Houston do to take advantage of them? So, but what's been going on with the D line?
They've been pretty hectic. Brendan Mott's one of the best pass rushers in the Big 12. I mentioned Romaine being one of the maybe the most surprising guy on the team, but Damian Elalio, the defensive tackle, has been very solid. Anuso Sayamalu maybe comes in on third down a lot. It is a nice 1-2 punch there at the tackle spot, but they have depth, and that linebacker depth is being tested right now. They've got injuries there to Bo Palmer as well as Ace Newsome. Those guys weren't crazy playmakers, but that's depth. And so K-State's thin at linebacker, but what makes that defensive line group pretty strong is they're rotating in guys at a good rate, and that keeps guys fresh and keeps guys on their feet, right? So the defensive line is, K-State's rushing attack on offense, top to bottom, has been great. But other than that, the defensive line, even when they're not getting sacks, like Brendan Mott, I don't know if pressure, do you have that on PFF or something? I don't know, but he's got to be high up in pressures.
Oh, and that's of his like categorical, like they break it down for that's his highest single category by kind of a lot. But I think that it's like you're saying, he appears, and frankly, I watched 3 games trying to figure out something, Tulane, Colorado, and BYU. And bluntly, I don't think Houston can pass the ball well enough to do what Colorado did. So I kind of wish I'd found a different one. So I may watch some Kansas between now and Saturday. But Mott can really get after it, and he was impressive for sure. Romaine is, like I said, he just makes plays that are really timely, and like I don't really have a stat for that. He just does, and I was like, well, crap. Well, that's even if Houston keeps it close, we got to find a guy to get a hat on that guy. The spread right now at FanDuel, our partners over at FanDuel, they got Kansas State by 12.5. I think that sounds high for what I anticipate being a low scoring game. The over under set at 45.5. So for that to be 12, it'd be like, to be under that, it'd have to be like 24-7 or anyway, 12.5 point spread here. What are you seeing? or say 12.5 point spread. I think it's the wrong thing. 12.5 point spread here. What are you seeing, and what does that mean to you? Does that sway you any one way? Do you think that's big, small, anything?
Well, it opened, I think, at 10.5. And so if you want to bet on Kansas State, you missed out on some value, bluntly put. But, I picked KU to cover last week, and they did. I think that game was I think it was 9.5, and that was just way too many in my eyes.
Yeah.
KU put up a good fight. That is the best 2-6 football team that you are ever going to see, Parker.
They put up a lot of points on Houston. They're one of those two.
Yeah. Sorry to bring up the sour memory, but the biggest kind of angle that I've taken this week with this game is the way that Kansas State played against KU was pretty ugly. I mean, Parker, Avery Johnson had a pretty uncharacteristic fumble, and there were just many mistakes in that game. To only win that game on a late field goal, kind of tells you what you need to know. It wasn't pretty for Kansas State. It just wasn't. And so I'm of the belief that that was kind of the wake up call for that team to bounce back, and kind of get back, get things back on track before the bye. Now I can absolutely see it. Like we talked about the road games prior and the hangover, I could see this not being the best matchup for Kansas State, just in terms of the game intangibles. But with the way that, K-State dodged a bullet, survived one against KU on Saturday, I think they're going to be much more focused after that wake-up call, maybe, that if you play like that again, it doesn't matter if it's, one of the quote-unquote bottom teams in the Big 12 like Houston. It's still a Willie Fritz coach team. It's a Big 12 team. You can't play like that. If you do, you are 100% on upset alert. And if this team has Big 12 hopes and aspirations like it does, got to lock in every single game.
Ryan, you're covering Kansas State football and basketball. They're poised to have a good basketball season. Y'all are doing a lot of content daily out there. And then, frankly, I listened to you and Tim and some of the guys and getting ready for stuff early in the week. What kind of stuff you got coming out this week and getting ready for the game, before, after, et cetera? What's the content push out like for the weekend at Go Power Cat?
Yeah, to get ready for the game. And I would encourage a Houston fan listening to this, our Power Cat pregame podcast. I'm on it with my betting segment, but former Wildcat offensive lineman Brian Hanley offers his perspectives. And then Ryan Wallace, who is kind of our main football guy, he's just got tremendous stuff, scouts Houston like none other. And so that's worthy of a listen without a doubt. But then we've got our questions podcast, Friday walkthrough, which is with our own Cole Carmody and former Wildcat defensive player Monty Spiller. And so there's so much content leading up to the game. And then obviously after the game, if K-State wins, I'm not sure why a Houston fan would want to listen, but if Houston wins, maybe you can stop by and listen to some of the post-game stuff as well.
We'll be live later in the day on this one as well, for if Kansas State's want to come either or drink in tears or hear what we think happened. We'll be live. It'll probably be later in that day. It might not be right in the afternoon game. Throw some stuff on again. I also coach things, but thank you for coming on, Ryan. I'm excited for this one this weekend, mostly because I kind of hope there's at least some redemption from the blowout game a year ago. Houston's held strong in some of these games till late. So anyway, we'll see how the weekend goes. But thank you again for stopping by Locked On Coogs today. For the folks at home looking for a second listen today, I'm going to recommend Locked On Big 12. Drake Toll's breaking down the whole conference over this. Go check them out as well. Locked On Coogs, primarily the Locked On podcast. Now is your team every day. Go Coogs.